Welcome to Media Empires, where we sit down with the most influential media creators right now to learn exactly how they built their empires. Our aim is to extract the secrets of top-tier podcasters, newsletter authors, and media creators who are breaking the old rules for media success. Whether you're looking to start your own empire or simply curious about the nuts and bolts behind media businesses, you'll find valuable insights and tactics in each episode. Grab your headphones, let's dive in.
This week on Media Empires, I'm joined by Dan Nee, CEO of TLDR, a modern media company running 10 curated newsletters with over 8 million readers. In this conversation, Dan shares the creation and growth of TLDR, challenges and opportunities of launching podcasts, and the importance of building an audience on your own property.
Thank you for joining Media Empires. I appreciate you coming on the podcast, talk about your success.
Super excited to be here.
Yeah. So you have done something pretty awesome with TLDR, which is you built this network of newsletters that have been taking off. Why don't you unpack what it is that you have exactly that you have today, and tell us a story. How did you get here? How did you build this?
Yeah, so we run a curated network of newsletters in technical topics like software engineering, AI, crypto, cybersecurity, et cetera. And we sort of hire people that worked day to day in those fields. So, for example, our web dev newsletter is written by a Google engineer and a Meta engineer. Our crypto newsletter is written by two folks at Coinbase and a crypto founder, and so on and so forth. So we hire practitioners in those fields to curate stories that are interesting to them. And in that sense, we're kind of like differentiated from traditional media in that when you're reading a story about AI in the New York Times, there's really only two stories, right? It's like, is AI going to kill us all, or is AI going to take all our jobs? And like we follow sort of like the technical innovation of those fields. Like we have like in our AI newsletter, we have a lot of preprints, GitHub repos, articles on like how to reduce inference costs and stuff that are like actually interesting to practitioners in the field, right? So our business model is like we sell advertising to these large developer tools and B2B SaaS companies like AWS and Google Cloud, et cetera. And I sort of think of TLDR as being the evolution of the front page of a newspaper. So if you think about like the sort of unbundling of the newspaper into sort of news feeds by Reddit and Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, we're kind of rebundling all the interesting stories from across the internet into an email, right? So I think a lot of people talk about algorithmic news feeds and how they sort of beat the front page of the newspaper. And I think that a massive advantage those algos had actually, it was not like necessarily the algorithmic curation that was better than the human curation. It was that those algos could pull stories from anywhere on the internet, whereas the front page of a newspaper can only pull stories from that day's edition of that specific newspaper, right? So like if you imagine like a subreddit that could only include links from like today's Wall Street Journal, like it'd be a pretty like uninteresting subreddit, right? So our sort of contention is that like in narrow domains, particularly technical ones that move pretty fast, like a group of humans that are experts in that domain with access to stories from anywhere on the internet will still be like substantially better than algorithms at this sort of curation. So I think we kind of fell backwards into this business model, to be honest. Like I used to run a SaaS company called Scraper API. It was like a developer tools company that let web developers build web scrapers. And so it was a slog. Like nobody ever emails like a SaaS company to say like you're doing a great job, right? It's always like your dashboard is slow, your API is down, yada yada, all that sort of stuff. And so around that time, I was reading about a company called The Skim. It was like sort of like the OG newsletter that I think like not a lot of people talk about them anymore. I think like there's a lot of like newsletters now that like were inspired by Morning Brew or what have you. But yeah, I think that like The Skim back then was like the hot thing. It was like a daily newsletter for millennial women, and so I thought I could do that for like software engineers. So TLDR was like sort of a side project at a time when I was like working on another company. And so I had this like existing audience of engineers from that company. Um, and there were like relatively few like newsletters at the time. So, if you got to a few thousand subscribers, like you were like reasonably big in the newsletter space at the time. And we would like sort of cross promote between my newsletter and sort of other newsletters that were targeting the developer niche. And so we would kind of like grow that way. And I knew so little about like paid advertising at the time that I was running ads on Reddit and Quora instead of like Facebook. And like if there's anyone listening to this that like is like trying to like start paid advertising, let me just save you the time. Do not use Reddit and Quora. Like definitely like start trying Facebook. And like if that doesn't work, like maybe try other things, but like definitely try that first. So yeah, I went full time on TLDR after I exited my previous company in 2021. And since then, we've sort of grown into adjacent niches. So not just software engineering, but also AI, cybersecurity, crypto, etc. And so now we're a collective of 10 newsletters, roughly a curation team of between 30 and 35, and 15 full time employees.
Love it. So well, I want to get into how you've done this, but first let's paint where we're going. So what are your aspirations for TLDR? You've been working on it for a few years full time. A few years from now, after you continue to grow your team and reach closer to your vision, like what does that vision look like?
Yeah, so I think like I would love for TLDR to eventually be a paper of record for technical topics related to sort of software engineering and that sort of stuff. So I think that like, the Wall Street Journal is a sort of paper of record for investors, and the New York Times is sort of a paper of record for, politics and media. I don't think that like tech really has, or at least like software engineering doesn't really have a sort of paper of record. So I would love for TLDR to sort of fill that niche.
How will you know when you've hit it? Like what does that mean practically?
Yeah, practically, it means that like I think great articles are legitimized and surfaced by TLDR. So I would say that like, how you can tell that like tech doesn't really have a paper of record is like, the really famous tech articles, right? Like Mark Andreessen saying like software is eating the world. That was published in the Wall Street Journal, right? It's not published in, TechCrunch or whatever. So I think that like we have aspirations to sort of be a sort of legitimizing force in the sort of like tech space. I do think that like we're sort of early in that mission. We do have like a lot of sort of founders and bloggers and so on and so forth that like, contact us and say like, hey, like we got like a ton of traffic from you guys, that's awesome. And I think that like being able to drive like a lot of traffic is an important part of that, but also I think just having like I think just being in business for a long time is very underrated in the media space. I think like that in and of itself is like quite legitimizing. So yeah, I think that like there will be like hopefully a generation of software engineers that grew up sort of reading TLDR and sort of like being on like the front, being in TLDR will be like the, look mom I made it moment for them, right?
Yeah,
And I think that like that's kind of how when you sort of meet
totally.
it as a company.
Do you feel like you need to do, and maybe you're already doing this and I just don't know, but like original reporting for that to happen? Like, yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that original reporting is an interesting and different business. We have discussed it before, but I don't view it as like super core to the mission. We're pretty focused on being a front page that like curates all of the awesome content that exists in various places on the internet. So I do think that like I think that there are a lot of like really great writers in tech right now. I don't think that like we're gonna write better stuff on say like financial tech than like Bern Hobart or something, right? Or like better stuff on like the future of crypto than like Balaji. But I do think that like we can sort of be that routing layer where we curate some of these like really important articles that are written.
Yeah. And so talk about how you built that first news, like, but even just there are different kinds of newsletters, right? So there's the Lenny Rachitsky, like, hey, I'm going to write original piece every week, once a week. And then there's like, do you see yourself as doing more like morning brew, but for tech or like, what is and did you experiment with different formats? What's like the format that you've landed on, and have you expanded that format to every category?
Yeah, I think we have like a format that's like pretty repeatable because it really is just like surfacing the best links in any given like technical domain. So I think that like The way we're structured is we have curation teams of 3 people for every newsletter. So and then we sort of hire people that are like within prominent companies within a sort of given niche, right? Like our AI newsletter, for example, it's all alums of OpenAI and Google. And so basically, these people like will help us like read through like a lot of this like very very technical stuff, and sort of like surface like the most interesting things. So I think that like that is actually a very repeatable model outside of software. Obviously we started within software because that's my background, but I do think that like there's no reason we can't do it for a biotech or a hardware engineering or any of these sort of technical fields.
Yeah. And so the curator model is fascinating. Like these people worked at OpenAI, like what's in it for them? How do you work with these curators? How do you incentivize them, et cetera? It's fascinating.
Yeah, we pay $100 an hour for all of our curators. It's sort of like I think people just enjoy having like part-time side hustles that are somewhat like adjacent to or in like the sort of content creation space. I would say that like that is one of the most surprising findings in running TLDR. Like our founders newsletter, like our first like curators were like people that had exited like $100 million companies, which I'm like, wait, why are you like applying for anything at that point, right? But it's yeah, I think people just like enjoy creating content, and the sort of part-time structure of what we do. We ask for like 1 to 2 hours a day of your time like per newsletter. And so I think that that's like a very tractable amount of time, even given a sort of like very intense full-time job, right? I sort of think of like part-time as being a sort of uh like a new type of like labor arbitrage. I think that there was a lot made of remote work in sort of the past decade, and I kind of think that like part-time could be that for the next decade, as like remote work kind of becomes saturated as a sort of selling point. I think you would be surprised at the type of people that you could get. Like, I mean, there are like founders of companies that take like part-time gigs as like a scout for A16Z or something, for example, right? Like you can never hire like Packy McCormick for a job, but I think he's like an A16Z like crypto scout or something. So I think that like these sorts of part-time jobs are a super interesting way to hire people that you couldn't otherwise hire.
Totally. And so so these curators basically are reading for interesting articles. They're probably doing that anyways because they, are passionate about the space, so they can sort of make some money doing it and sort of, have a community and stuff like that.
Totally.
And then you have maybe someone who reviews it all and makes sure they're aggregating links basically.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. We work out of Slack and a Google Doc, and we have RSS feeds set up, and Twitter lists. I think those are like probably the two like primary ways that we aggregate. And sort of like a couple things that I tell curators when they come on board is like like you should own like the North Star for what you put in the newsletter should be like, would I send this in a group chat, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that like looks like news that like appears in newspapers, but like nobody's actually interested in it, right? Like I think like in a lot of like tech spaces, I would say a fundraising announcement is exactly this, right? Like XYZ raised like a Series A, like you kind of skim over it and then like glom onto the next story, right? So I think that like, would I send this in a group chat is like a really great bar for like, should I send this out in the email? And is it actually interesting, or is it something that looks like news? Um, I would say that like we also just get better over time because we try to reverse engineer like really great stories from small sources. I think that like one of the things that we found is that like there is like a slight negative correlation between how often someone posts and how like really great and niche the content is. There are a lot of like really great blogs that post, like 4 or 5 times a year. And like how do we like reliably surface those types of posts? We sort of like aggregate those sorts of blogs into RSS readers, and sort of like, TLDR has probably over 3 or 4 thousand sources at this point, like individual sources in our RSS feed, for like the original newsletter. And there's like we have like several feeds. But yeah, I think that like just having that like huge number of sources, like this huge number of like small niche blogs that are sort of labors of love that post very infrequently and are sort of like not super economically motivated, but like some like random engineer building something amazing like 2 or 3 times a year. I think that allows us to get better and better over time, because like who else is putting in the work to like really really find those blogs, right?
Totally. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so what does the rest of the team do, or how's your team set up?
Yeah, so the entirety of the curate all of our curators are part time, because we want them to be working full time in these sort of industries that they're curating for. So the vast majority of the team is actually in sort of go to market, sort of ad sales, like BDRs, demand generation, success, etc.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey, everybody. If you don't already subscribe to the Media Empires newsletter, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power this and other Turpentine newsletters is called Beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business. And they built Beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails, from essayists to business owners. The platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. Beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The Beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, Newsletter Operator, and so many more. Beehiiv's founder hooked up Media Empires listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code EMPIRES. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.
So we have one person on sales doing everything. God bless him. But we need to think, about building a more comprehensive sales organization. How did you build out your sales organization? What have you found is working, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think we were really lucky to get our current head of sales, who previously ran ads at Stack Overflow, because he sort of had this experience building out an ad sales business. I would say that like in the beginning, founder-led sales or like single really great salesperson sales are just incredibly effective. And I really think that like you should stay with that model as long as at all possible. Like I did all of our sales until we were at about 2.5 million in annual revenue. Um to sort of give you a sense there. But I think that like over time we're like that sort of obviously breaks down. I think that's actually just generally true, that like you should try to do founder-led sales as long as absolutely possible. And and because like people love talking to the founders, and they're like willing to forgive a lot if if they know they're able to like talk to decision makers sort of instantly and like have their problem solved, right? I would say that in terms of like media sales in particular, it's kind of interesting, because like in my background, like I sort of like previously ran a SaaS company, right? And the sort of like uh the sort of like objection that you always have as in most SaaS products is like, why do I need this product instead of a spreadsheet, or building it myself, or like using an open source solution or whatever, right? Like that's the sort of common objection. Whereas like everybody in the world running any business knows that they need advertising, right? Like they need to get more customers. That's pretty basic stuff. So like advertising is like some they already know they need it, but I think the challenge is that like it's sort of like attention is like broadly like a commodity product, right? In many ways, like it's not like truly a commodity. Like it is like better to sort of be in a Turpentine podcast than like generic sort of like Google Ads like website or whatever, right? But broadly, like if you're doing some sort of performance advertising or even brand advertising, you're being benchmarked against these like very large companies like Meta and Google, etc. So like just pricing like reasonably relative to those companies, and like creating an environment in which like your salespeople feel comfortable, like making the marketers that they work with look good is like super super important, right? Because like at the end of the day, that's like sort of what I tell like our new salespeople. Like this is like really what matters. Like if the marketers that we work with know that we will do whatever we can to make them look good, like look good to their boss, look good to whoever they're reporting to, and sort of like have that like trust that we will fix any problems that they have, then they will be like willing to work with us long term, right? And that's really what's important in sort of like an advertising motion, because as you probably know, like a regional deal, like the initial deal in most advertising contracts is sort of like a test run of your channel, like is it going to perform or whatever, and then sort of the real money comes on the back end after you've been working together for like months or years or whatever. You sort of like build that account, and so we are sort of in the business of like building that level of trust.
That makes a lot of sense. How do you guys think about which demographics, or sorry, which like niches and categories to go to next? You mentioned you're at 10 now. Can you get to 100? Like how many categories can this expand to?
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, 100 seems really daunting just because it's a big number, but I don't have like a sort of like good sense of what the actual cap is. Like maybe we can get to 100, who knows. I think that like we tend to try to go into adjacent niches, and we do have like readers that write in and ask us like, "Hey, do you have XYZ newsletter?" Our business model is primarily selling to B2B SaaS and sort of um like those sorts of companies. And so like I think it would be challenging for us to expand into niches where there isn't a lot of B2B SaaS, at least like given how we're currently constructed. So like I guess like one thing that, yeah, like for example, one niche that like we do get like requests for pretty often is gaming, right? I'm not a big gamer, to be honest. I don't know like what the business model for a TLDR gaming would necessarily be. Like it doesn't seem like we could sell like a gaming newsletter advertisement to many of our existing customers. So I think that would be an example of something where it would be tough for us to go in there. I think that like for what we do right now, I think like technical niches are super interesting to us because we can create content that's like super super differentiated.
Do you do anything on community at the moment? Like, yeah, do you like aggregate your readers in group chats, or do you do anything there?
Yeah, to answer your question directly, no. I feel like there it's when one thing is working, like the sort of like natural thing is to try a million other different things. But I think in almost every case you should just keep doing more of the thing that is working. Um I would say like communities are super interesting to me. I think everybody that listens to this is part of a lot of online communities. But I think it's just like a totally different business than the one we're in, right? I would say that
Totally.
like a lot of people ask us to launch things that like a Discord or like any sort of community product. And like the other big one that people ask us for a lot is like podcasts, right? And I think that like people really underestimate like how different all of these products are. Like people broadly think of them as like media products, right? Like you run a popular newsletter, therefore like you could probably run like a popular community or podcast. I actually really, really, really don't think that's true. I think that like it's almost like finding product market fit all over again. Like like if you think about it, like if Joe Rogan wrote a newsletter, would you read it? Like, would you read the Joe Rogan? Like, probably not, right? Like, he's great podcaster, but like totally different product once you cross that to a different medium. Um, so yeah, I think that like maybe we'll do a community product in the future or maybe far future, but there are like no sort of immediate plans for that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm thinking through the same thing, right? Like, I like you have gone deep on on a format, right? You've
Yeah,
gone deep on newsletters. I've gone deep on podcasts. But some people give the advice of like, hey, the other way to think about it is you go deep on an audience, right? If you have software engineers, you've gone deep on AI, like keep reaching that audience, but with different things. And so that and build a vertical media company like Freightwaves is built for trucking, or I
right.
just had dealership guy on who's done that for the automotive industry. And if you're able to pull off the, hey, for one specific audience, you could do a newsletter and a podcast, or like Blockworks, what they've done for crypto, and an event, then you could reach them multiple ways. Then you're really monopolizing their attention, and there's a lot of value there. But like you say, it's really hard to do. And so, we've been wanting to do newsletters for, since the beginning of Turpentine. I remember I called you last year. I was like, hey, how do we do this?
Sure.
And it's just been incrementally easier for us to launch podcasts because like you said, when something's working, just keep doing that thing at the same time. And there's overlap with audiences, but but there is enough. But I see the Blockworks, I see the freight waves, and I'm like, wow, if we could figure that out, that would be pretty cool.
Totally. I would say I really think that like the jump between mediums is bigger than the jump between subject matters in the same medium. And I think it's like not really too close. Like certainly if you're like a deep industry expert in a particular vertical, it's much easier. Like Bern Hobart shouldn't launch a supply chain newsletter, right? He should definitely go on the riff and just like talk about financial topics with you, and that is like an easy jump for someone like him to make. So I would say like if you're a super deep industry expert in one particular industry and you write sort of analytical content, like a sort of like Ben Thompson at Stratechery or something like that. Then it might make sense just to cross mediums and sort of bring that audience. But as a sort of like media company that has like a figured out format, a sort of format first company like TLDR is, like it is like much harder for us to jump to podcasts than I think a lot of people would imagine.
Yeah, totally. So the guy's numbers, your numbers are phenomenal in terms of what you've been able to do in terms of readership. What channels have been the besides, of course, creating good content, which is the foundation of everything? What channels have been most effective? Slash, what's your advice or philosophy on growing newsletters?
Right. I think that like roughly we're like 50-50 paid versus organic. I think that like organic is it's like it's obviously like preferred, but like you can only like it like paid is more controllable, right? So there's always that sort of trade-off. I would say that like actually the number that like we are more focused on is churn. I think that that is like very underrated by many newsletter operators. Like in the beginning, it always looks like when you have like a very limited audience, you're always kind of growing, and like you sort of don't realize the leaky bucket problem in many cases until it's too late, right? We like we think a lot about sort of like minimizing churn and sort of like what like we actually cut down like churn cohorts by like channels and like where are like we getting like a lot of like churning accounts from and all that sort of stuff. So I think that that's like super important. But broadly, wouldn't say that we're doing anything much different on the growth side than most newsletters do. We have a referral program, we have like Facebook and Twitter ads, and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't think that we're doing anything like crazy smart on that end.
The On the How about on the monetization? You guys monetize really well. How What have you learned about packaging or pricing, or what's when you work with advertisers, are they working across a suite of newsletters, or yeah, share your advice there.
Yeah, they are working across the slate of newsletters, and so I think that that's another area in which like working in adjacent niches has really helped us. And I think that like yeah, I would say that like when we launch new newsletters, we think about adjacency both in terms of our existing audience and our existing advertiser base, right? And if it's like a sort of if we have like advertisers that would want to advertise in a given newsletter and readers that want to read a given newsletter, then it becomes like a no-brainer to launch, right? But we actually want to fulfill both of those conditions before we launch something new. And so I think that's something that like we used to not sort of be sophisticated about at all. Like the second newsletter actually came out because I was writing the original newsletter, and then like I'm interested in crypto stuff. So like when like all the sort of crypto boom in like 2021 happened, I was like, great, like I'll put tons of crypto stuff in the newsletter. And then people would complain. They're like, look, I'm not reading TLDR because it's like a crypto newsletter, right? So the second newsletter actually came about because like I split off all the crypto content into its own thing. So back then we were really, really not sophisticated about that, and we had like tons of trouble like selling crypto in the beginning because we had like nobody like in our existing like sort of advertiser pool that like wanted anything to do with it. So yeah, now I think we make sure that we have a fit on both sides before we launch something.
That that makes sense. And the and what are the like the length of the deals? Has it is it something you guys are doing annual stuff? Is it short term or like what are the deals themselves? How do they look?
Yeah, we primarily book quarter to quarter just because a lot of our newsletters are growing so fast that a CPM based deal for today in like 4 quarters is going to look like a very crazy CPM. But I do think that like longer term, we do want to move towards larger deals as our sort of newsletters get more mature, right? I think that like you're always going to top out at like some sort of like our target addressable market isn't like everyone in the world, right? It's like a fairly like niche audience, like most B2B audiences are, and so like as we get closer to saturating those niches, then like we will like have like more reasonable looking growth, like maybe 10% a quarter or something like more tractable, and then it will make sense for us to sell longer deals. um yeah, I would say that like right now we're in the early stages of creating our go to market motion. Like we hired our first demand generation person in January. We hired our first success person in January. We doubled our number of sales reps from 3 to 6 in January, or not January, Q1. We doubled our number of sales reps in Q1. So we're sort of like building out that go to market motion that you would see in any sort of tech company.
Yeah, that's really it's really fascinating. What are the say more about the types of customers that you've like how many startups like what size?
Yeah, originally I think it's easy to start with startups. They're sort of more willing to take a chance on these sort of very niche very niche channels if they feel like there might be performance benefits, right? Like you're always just trying to like if you're like a very cash strapped like series a seed like seed stage or series A startup, then you're sort of looking for any advantage that you can get. We've sort of moved up market into these like larger cloud companies as we've gotten bigger and like big enough to become interesting to them. So I think like this quarter is the first quarter we worked with Google Cloud and NVIDIA. Last quarter we signed like AWS and Cloudflare, and so like these are the sort of like customers that I think that like will like drive most of the growth long term. We still do have like a lot of advertisers that are in the sort of like growth stage of companies, and I think we like share a lot of these sort of like mutual sponsors, right? Like I think like Secure Frame and those sorts of companies that are basically I tell like our new salespeople like our target addressable market is just people that buy billboards and SF. It's basically that crowd of folks that is like the sort of core TLDR audience, but um I do think that like we are trying to move up market a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. So putting what you said before around if you're good at one format, stick to that format to the one side, because that's what you might give the advice for me of like, hey, quadruple down on podcasts and just launch, the biggest podcast network in tech. But let's say we were like dead set on getting into the newsletter game.
Sure.
And we weren't going to, do the links thing. We're going to do something else. Um, and we could either like based on my advice is what should we do? We could go on a few categories. Like we have 3 shows in AI. Maybe we have an AI newsletter. Maybe it's a roundup of what happened in the podcast. Maybe we try to create like what Barry Weiss has created with the free press and
Mhm.
just get all these guest posts
Mhm.
or first round reviews. Do that. They used to interview people and then sort of do guest posts on their behalf. Maybe we try to get into what the information is doing in terms of like actual hire reporters, except they're more like traditional media. We'd be more like, focused on stuff that helps people get better at their jobs.
Sure.
But we could go super wide. We could go say, hey, this is just Turpentine and it's just like what TechCrunch used to be or something? Different ways to handle it. Like, how would you think about it if you were us?
Well, I think that your model is super, super interesting in that, as far as I can tell, I don't know if this is like the explicit strategy, but you're taking people that like, A, have been like awesome guests on your previous podcast, and B, have an existing audience in some niche that's not podcasts and bringing them, and like helping them launch something, right? Like, Samo Berja, for live players and like the Riff for, Burn Hobart are like, those are the two that I really like. And obviously like I listen to Moment as of Zen and stuff like that. But I would say that like if I were you and I was dead set on getting into newsletters, I would say that like analysis type newsletters like a sort of Stratechery and those sorts of newsletters would be the type of newsletter I would target. And I would sort of take people that were successful, like do the reverse of what you're doing, right? Like take people that like have a successful podcast or a successful
Right.
YouTube channel or something, and help them write newsletters, and maybe even like have like hire a ghostwriter that will like have a conversation with them and just like have them give their takes, and then you like write and edit that and then turn it into a newsletter, right? Because like maybe they just don't want to sit down and write like 2,000 words. Maybe that's the blocker,
Yeah.
right? So I think you could add a lot of value there. I don't think there's like anyone that like I listen to a podcast to where I wouldn't like read an equivalent like analytical newsletter from.
I really like that idea. But I have friends at Smooth Media who've done that with Colin Samir. They went to their
Mhm.
YouTube channel and said, "Hey, let's create a newsletter around it," and it's quite good. And then also, I have these friends who've done that for a basketball YouTuber who's very big, and the newsletter is called Enjoy B-Ball. They got to a couple 100,000 sort of subscribers, and it's a pretty good distribution hack. What it doesn't do necessarily is build out the Turpentine brand, although we could
Sure.
have them all under the Turpentine website and try to create a destination site. But yeah, I mean, that's a pretty interesting idea.
Yeah, I guess. Do you guys see yourselves as more of a back end company or a sort of sort of media brand that has like sort of sub brands?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that yet. I think we started out definitely as a back end company. That's
Mhm.
like how we got our leveraging other people's distribution. But
Mhm.
I think that we think, I think in order to be defensible, we need to have the Turpentine brand mean something, right? So that people want to partner with, like people want to partner with Morning Brew because they have 4 million subscribers and it's Morning Brew, right? So our brand, like I think we want to leverage other people's brands to then build our own brand. And maybe it's
Mhm.
just another way of doing that. Um, but yeah, we're going to change some of the names of the show to like Turpentine AI or Turpentine Finance. It's cool that you are you've got TLDR across everything, so you've been built up brand equity in TLDR. But I feel like being a back end allows you to partner with other people, and that's great. Like
Mhm.
Blockworks, for example, that's how they started. They worked with Anthony
Yeah.
Pompliano, but they saw that Anthony had all the leverage
Right.
because the show just got bigger and bigger. He could just renegotiate with them. They're like, wait, we need an audience. We need to
Sure.
own our audience directly. Otherwise, the host can just leave. Um,
Totally.
so similarly, yeah, I feel like we need to build our owned audience. But a good way to bootstrap that is to do it off of somebody else's. And we've done that for podcasting,
Mhm.
and we might need to do it for newsletters too, because every medium is new.
Sure.
It's like a new startup, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I do think that I really do think that there is a way to build a defensible back-end media company. I think buy sell ads is essentially that, right? And they really only do the ad side. Like I think building an ad sales team is hard and building a growth team is hard. And that's like obviously like the YouTube is like much much bigger than what we're building. But they take care of like both distribution and monetization, and I think that's super powerful in that, like, you're not like most other mediums will select for creators that are also at least okay at business and marketing. Whereas on YouTube in particular, because they take care of everything else, they can have super, super product focused creators like Mr. Beast or something, right? Who can just focus on the content creation and like or like any of these people on YouTube that like might not necessarily have the chops to actually run a media business, but actually do have like like are great at creating content, right? So I think that like the more that you abstract away on the back end, the more that you actually unlock like your universe of creators that you could work with. Um, so I think I would disagree on like the back end not actually being defensible. I think that there are like huge scale effects, especially on the sales side.
Yeah, that's true.
But I can understand that like in building a media company, you would want like your brand to be upfront, and I think that like you have a lot of optionality, right? Because like you are in a lot of these podcasts, where like you're the one that's like having a chat with like Bern and Samo and all these guys. Um, I think that's super interesting, and I think it's like an interesting model, right? Where like you are getting the benefits of by personally being in a lot of these podcasts. Like I think that there are a lot of creators that are just like so front and center in their company that like their company actually builds no enterprise value, right? Like if Mr. Beast left the Mr. Beast YouTube channel, it might not be worth very much at all, right? Like all of the value is actually in the creator himself doing stuff. But on the other hand, if there's like, I don't think that like people are nearly as loyal to like any brand as they are an individual, right? So like I will listen to like Moment of Zen and it's like, oh, like Eric and Dan are just like kind of yammering on about this or that. And it really doesn't even matter to me like what you guys are really talking about on a given week, right? It's like totally random stuff. And it's always super interesting to me. Um so I think that like you're kind of getting the best of both worlds in that like you have this like sort of personal monopoly that you build by being like pretty front and center in the media company, but you're still building enterprise value by having the sort of like machine that in theory could run without you in a lot of ways. I think it's interesting to straddle that line. And like there are like media companies that have been better and worse at that, right? Like I think in the previous generation, like it's interesting to me that like The Ringer was able to be sold for $200 million to Spotify when like it was like really like a star vehicle for Bill Simmons, right? And I guess like Ezra Klein at Vox Media is like a similar sort of like star vehicle story. It's like an interesting line to straddle, I think, and I think that like a lot of media companies tend to be too much on one side or the other, and getting the best of both worlds is a really rare thing.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. I appreciate that. That's a good way of looking at it. Um, Gearing towards closing here, is there anything about TLDR that we haven't discussed yet that you think might be pretty relevant to other people listening and who are aspiring to build their own, whether it's newsletter or media empires more broadly?
Yeah, I would say that like it's not an accident that you're in podcasts for right now, and I'm in newsletters. I think that like the sort of lesson from the past 10 years of media is that like you should not build your audience on someone else's property. I think like a lot of companies got like sort of screwed over by Facebook video shutting down and all that sort of stuff. I think that like right now is like an interesting time for distribution on particularly Twitter and LinkedIn, I would say, especially for like B2B media like we're creating. If I were starting today, which is I guess sort of like what you're getting at with the thrust of this question, I would start with a Twitter or LinkedIn account with keeping in mind that the ultimate goal is to build a successful newsletter or podcast. um I think that like those two give you like really great distribution right now in exchange for your content, but I wouldn't stay on them forever. I think that like the only sort of social platform that I would be willing to stay on long term because the juice is worth the squeeze is probably YouTube, and for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, because they just abstract away so much and they take care of so much for you, and they're just like sort of a monopoly in like video hosting anyways. So like what are you going to do, move to Vimeo or something? So I would say like start on like LinkedIn or Twitter, and eventually build something that you own.
Awesome. I appreciate that as closing words. Do you have any? I ask our guests. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh wow! I feel like we've chatted before at length, so not necessarily, but I think yeah, I'm like kind of a Turpentine super fan. I don't know like the
Appreciate
average number of podcasts that one of your listeners listens to, but I'm probably at like 3 or 4, like pretty consistently a week. So yeah,
it.
I'm a fan, and just keep building what you're building.
I appreciate that. I and we definitely look up to the empire that you've built with TLDR. It's really impressive how you've been able to go deep across many different technical categories and build this sort of expert curator set. I agree with you in sort of the part-time labor arbitrage. We do that for podcasting, and I was thinking, how could that be done for other formats? And you've done it with newsletters in a pretty special way. So it seems like you've struck a gold mine in terms of this format that I don't see why there's any limit to how big and how deep you can go with it, given how big the newsletter economy is and it's growing and all these different niches. And hey, people want to know what's happening. So congrats on the empire that you've built. Although also, in some sense, you're just starting relative to what it will be. And thank you for sharing some of your hard-earned wisdom with us in the podcast today.
Really appreciate it, Erik.